He thought it would be funny to humiliate a weak man in front of a room full of players, but he had no idea he was about to humiliate himself instead. The tournament hall stretched wide under bright fluorescent lights, rows of polished wooden boards reflecting quiet tension as clocks ticked softly in the background, each second echoing across the marble floor like a countdown no one could escape. And at the center of it all stood Richard Hayes, a white American Grandmaster in his early 40s, known not just for his victories, but for the way he carried them. Sharp smile, tailored suit, and the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. The kind that made people step aside before he even spoke. And when his eyes landed on Ethan Cole, everything shifted just a little, because Ethan didn't belong. Not here, not in this room filled with elite players and sponsors in pressed jackets and polished shoes. Ethan stood near the edge of the tables, thin frame, slightly hunched posture, wearing a faded button-down shirt that looked like it had seen too many laundromat cycles, his hands resting quietly in his pockets as if he were trying not to take up space. And that was all Richard needed, one glance, one judgment, one opportunity to turn a quiet man into a spectacle. "You here to watch or get lost?" Richard said, loud enough for nearby players to hear. A few chuckles breaking the silence as heads turned, curious, waiting, always waiting for entertainment in places where egos ran high. Ethan didn't answer, not immediately. He just looked at the board in front of Richard, eyes steady, unreadable, and that stillness, that refusal to react, only made the moment more interesting, more tempting, more dangerous. "Tell you what," Richard continued, leaning back in his chair, tapping the table with casual authority, "sit down. One game. Give these people something to laugh about." The crowd leaned in, phones subtly lifted, whispers threading through the room, because everyone knew how this would end. They had seen this before, the outsider stepping into a world that wasn't his, the quick defeat, the polite applause, the quiet exit. But as Ethan slowly pulled out the chair and sat across from him, something in the air changed, not loud, not obvious, just a shift, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it didn't yet understand. The first move landed with a soft, almost insignificant click, a pawn forward 2 squares. Nothing flashy, nothing bold, just correct, and Richard barely glanced at it, his fingers already reaching for his own piece with the relaxed confidence of a man who had played this opening thousands of times. His reply quick, almost dismissive, as if the game had already been decided before it began. A few spectators leaned closer, whispering predictions, some already smirking, expecting a swift and effortless display of superiority. But Ethan did not rush. His hand hovered for just a fraction of a second before placing his next move with the same quiet precision. No hesitation, no wasted motion. And that was the first subtle crack, not in the board, but in the rhythm Richard was used to controlling. Because this was not panic. This was not guessing. This was structure, move after move. Ethan built something invisible to the casual eye, a position that looked ordinary but felt increasingly uncomfortable, and Richard noticed it, not consciously at first, just a slight tightening in his jaw, a longer pause before his third move, then his fourth. The audience shifted, the initial amusement fading into something quieter, more attentive, because the game was not ending quickly. It was unfolding, slowly, deliberately, like a story no one expected to hear. Richard leaned back briefly, studying Ethan now instead of the board, trying to read him, but Ethan gave nothing away, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, eyes steady, as if the noise of the room did not exist, as if this moment had happened before, many times, somewhere else, in places no one here had seen. And then it happened, a single move, simple on the surface, but placed with such exact timing that Richard froze for just a second longer than he should have, his fingers hovering above the piece, his mind recalculating, adjusting, realizing that the position in front of him was no longer comfortable. It was complicated, and complications were dangerous, especially when they were introduced by someone who was supposed to be weak. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not loud, not obvious, just enough to signal that something had changed, that this was no longer entertainment, this was uncertainty. And for the first time since the game began, Richard did not look at the audience, he did not smile, he looked only at the board. And in that quiet shift, the balance of power began to move. almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, toward the man everyone had already underestimated. Richard adjusted his posture, leaning forward now, elbows closer to the table, the casual arrogance from earlier fading into something sharper, more focused, because the board in front of him no longer felt like a performance. It felt like a problem, and not the kind he solved for applause, but the kind that demanded respect. His next move came slower, calculated, but when his fingers released the piece, there was no confidence in the gesture, only necessity, and across from him, Ethan responded almost immediately, not rushed, not reckless, just certain, as if every square had already been mapped out long before he ever sat down. And that certainty began to spread through the room, quiet at first, then undeniable. The whispers stopped, phones lowered, even the subtle movements of chairs and footsteps seemed to fade, replaced by a stillness that pressed against the air. Richard exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the board again, deeper this time, searching for a line, an escape, something he could control, but every variation he calculated led him back to the same uncomfortable truth. He was reacting, not leading, and that realization hit harder than any loss ever could, because control was everything to him, and it was slipping, move by move, into the hands of someone he had already dismissed. A faint crease formed between his brows as he reached for another piece, hesitating just long enough for a few in the crowd to notice, and that hesitation spoke louder than any mistake. It said what no one dared to say out loud, that this was no longer a mismatch. This was a challenge, and not one he was winning. Ethan remained still, his breathing steady, his gaze never drifting. Each time Richard looked up, hoping to catch a flicker of nerves, he found nothing. No fear, no doubt, just a quiet awareness that made the entire moment feel inevitable. And then came another move, subtle, almost invisible to anyone without deep understanding, but it landed with weight, shifting the entire structure of the game. Richard froze, not dramatically, not obviously, just a fraction longer than before, but this time it was different. This time the pause carried recognition. His eyes narrowed, scanning the board from a new angle. And for the first time since the game began, he was no longer trying to win. He was trying to understand who he was really sitting across from. Because whatever this was, whoever this man was, it was no longer a joke, and the room felt it, that quiet, creeping realization that something far bigger than a simple game was unfolding right in front of them. The clock on the side table ticked louder now, or maybe it only felt that way, because every second stretched as Richard stared at the board, no longer seeing pieces but possibilities collapsing one by one, his fingers resting lightly on a knight before pulling back, then hovering over a rook, then stopping entirely. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Not anymore. The audience had shifted completely. No one was smiling. No one was whispering. They were watching, truly watching, as if they had stumbled into something they were not meant to witness. A slow unraveling of certainty. And across from him, Ethan remained unchanged, his posture steady, his hands calm, waiting, not pressing, not rushing, just allowing the position to speak for itself. And that was what made it unsettling. There was no aggression, no attempt to dominate, only precision, quiet and absolute. Richard finally made his move, placing the piece with care, but the sound it made against the board felt heavier than before, like a decision made under pressure rather than control. Ethan responded almost instantly, his piece sliding into place with a soft click that echoed across the silence. And in that moment, something shifted again, more visibly this time. Richard leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, scanning the board from a distance as if stepping away might reveal a hidden flaw. But there was none. Every line he followed led him deeper into a position that felt increasingly tight, increasingly restricted, like the space around his options was shrinking without warning. A bead of tension settled into his expression, subtle, but real, and then it happened. A realization not yet spoken but fully formed. His opponent was not reacting. He was guiding. Every move, every pause, every sequence had intention behind it, layered, deliberate, and far beyond casual play. A man near the back of the room leaned forward, squinting slightly as if trying to place a memory. Another glanced at Ethan more carefully now, noticing the stillness, the familiarity in the way he held the board, not like a visitor, but like someone who had lived in positions like this for years, decades even. Richard exhaled slowly, placing his hand flat on the table for a brief moment, grounding himself. But when he looked up again, it was different. The confidence had not returned. Instead, there was something else, something quieter, heavier, the beginning of recognition. And as Ethan lifted his next piece without hesitation, placing it exactly where it needed to be, the room seemed to tighten around that single move, because deep down, everyone could feel it now. This was not a surprise anymore. This was a revelation unfolding one step at a time. And Richard Hayes was no longer the one in control of it. Richard's fingers hovered above the board again. But this time there was no disguise, no attempt to mask the hesitation. It was visible, real, and the room felt it immediately. The subtle shift from curiosity to realization settling into every corner of the hall. Because what they were witnessing was no longer just a difficult game. It was a dismantling, slow and precise, unfolding move by move without a single wasted action. Ethan sat exactly as before, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, his presence almost quiet enough to disappear if not for the undeniable weight of every move he made. And that contrast, that stillness against Richard's growing tension, made the moment feel even heavier. Richard finally committed, placing his piece down with more force than necessary, the sound sharp against the silence. But it did not change anything. It did not relieve the pressure building on the board. Ethan responded instantly, not rushed, not aggressive, just inevitable. And that was when it happened. A man near the front row leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as if trying to pull a memory from somewhere distant. His lips parted slightly. Before he spoke, barely above a whisper, but in a room this quiet, it carried that position. "I have seen that before." Another voice followed, hesitant, uncertain. "No, it cannot be, but it could." And the more they watched, the clearer it became. The patterns, the structure, the quiet control. This was not random. This was not learned casually. This was experience layered over years of mastery. Richard heard it too. The whispers, the shifting tone of the room. And for the first time, he looked away from the board, scanning the faces around him, searching for something, reassurance, denial, anything that would tell him this was still under his control. But there was nothing, only eyes fixed on the game, not on him. And that absence of attention hit harder than any defeat ever could, because Richard Hayes was used to being the center, the one everyone watched, the one everyone measured themselves against. And now that focus had shifted completely, quietly, without announcement, toward the man sitting across from him. Ethan made another move, simple, almost understated, but it locked the position further, tightening the invisible net around Richard's options. And this time, Richard did not move immediately. He leaned back, staring at the board as if it might change if he looked long enough. But it did not. It remained exactly as it was, controlled, calculated, and unforgiving in its precision. The silence deepened, no longer just anticipation, but understanding. Something significant was unfolding, something that could not be undone. And as Ethan calmly rested his hands once more, waiting without pressure, without expression, the truth edged closer to the surface. Undeniable now, that this quiet, unassuming man was not just playing the game, he was defining it. Richard's hand remained suspended above the board, but now it was no longer a moment of calculation. It was hesitation shaped by something deeper, something heavier, because every path he explored ended the same way, restricted, controlled, anticipated, and that realization settled into his expression, subtle but unmistakable. The confidence that once defined him now replaced by careful restraint, as if one wrong move would not just cost him the game, but expose something far more damaging. Across from him, Ethan did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, not with intensity, not with pressure, but with a calm awareness that made the entire moment feel already decided. The room had fallen completely silent now. No shifting chairs, no whispered commentary. Just the faint ticking of the clock and the quiet presence of dozens of people witnessing something they did not fully understand but could not look away from. A man near the side table leaned toward another, his voice barely audible. "That structure, that control. I have seen it in championship games." The other man shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on Ethan, No, this is not just strong play. This is something else. Richard heard fragments of it, enough to feel the shift, enough to know the room was no longer on his side, and that absence of silent support pressed against him more than any opponent ever had. He finally made his move, slower than before, placing the piece with deliberate care. But the sound it made felt final, like closing a door he could not reopen. Ethan responded instantly, not aggressively, not dramatically, just precisely, placing his piece in a position that changed everything. The board seemed to tighten in that moment, lines closing, options disappearing, and Richard saw it, fully this time, not as a possibility, not as a threat, but as a reality. His eyes lingered on the position, tracing lines, searching for anything he had missed. But there was nothing left to uncover, only the clear, undeniable truth of what had been building since the very first move, a quiet understanding. Settled over the room, spreading from one observer to another, not spoken, but felt. This was no accident. This was mastery, and it had been there all along, hidden beneath a calm presence no one had taken seriously. Richard leaned back slowly, his gaze lifting from the board to Ethan for the first time with something that had not been there before, not arrogance, not dismissal, but recognition. And as Ethan rested his hands once more, waiting without urgency, without emotion, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because everyone could feel it now, the moment just before the truth would be spoken out loud, the moment when everything they thought they understood would no longer hold, and Richard Hayes, for the first time in years, had nothing left to control. Richard did not reach for another piece this time, his hands resting on the edge of the table as his eyes remained fixed on the board, not searching anymore, not calculating, just seeing, truly seeing what had been there all along. Every move leading to this exact position, every choice narrowing the path until there was only one direction left, and it was not his. The weight of that realization settled over him, heavy but undeniable, and across the board, Ethan finally moved again, not with urgency, not with force, but with quiet certainty, his fingers placing the piece with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo through the entire room. And that was it. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. The structure on the board shifted into something unmistakable, a position that no longer offered resistance, only acceptance. A few in the crowd leaned forward instinctively, their eyes widening as they traced the lines, following the sequence that had just been completed, and then it began, the recognition spreading, one person at a time, like a silent wave moving through the room. That is a forced finish, someone whispered. Another voice followed, more certain. No, that is not just a finish, that is a signature. Richard heard it, every word landing with quiet precision. And for a moment, he closed his eyes, just briefly, as if confirming what he already knew. When he opened them again, he did not look at the board first. He looked at Ethan, really looked this time, past the worn shirt, past the quiet posture, into something deeper, something that no longer fit the image he had created at the start of the game. And in that moment, the gap between assumption and reality became impossible to ignore. The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke, waiting for something, anything, but nothing came. Because there was nothing left to say, the board had already spoken. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, his expression no longer tense, no longer searching, just still, as if the answer had settled into place whether he accepted it or not. And across from him, Ethan did not react. He did not celebrate. He did not even look around. He simply rested his hands once more, calm, composed, as if this moment was no different from any other, and that quiet control, that complete absence of ego, made the realization even sharper, because this was not someone who needed to prove anything. This was someone who already had, and the room could feel it now, fully, completely, that they were not watching an upset, they were witnessing a revelation, one that had been hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. No one moved when the final position settled on the board. It was as if the entire room had been frozen in place by something far greater than the game itself, a quiet, undeniable truth that had revealed itself without warning. And then, from somewhere near the back, a voice broke the silence, hesitant at first, almost afraid to say it out loud. Wait, that sequence, that is not just strong play. Another voice followed, more certain, cutting through the tension like a realization finally. Spoken, that is Grandmaster level. The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible, and suddenly the room shifted again. But this time it was not curiosity or doubt. It was recognition. People leaned in closer, eyes no longer scanning the board but studying Ethan, really studying him, as if trying to reconcile the quiet man in the worn shirt with the precision they had just witnessed. Richard did not speak. His gaze lowered briefly to the board one last time before, lifting again, slower now, more deliberate, as if each movement carried weight he could not ignore. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, but steady, controlled, and beneath it, something else, something that had not been there before. Ethan did not answer immediately. He simply reached forward and adjusted a single piece, not changing the outcome, just aligning it, a small, almost instinctive gesture that spoke louder than any introduction, the kind of movement that came from years of familiarity, of repetition, of mastery so ingrained it no longer needed to be displayed. A man near the front stepped closer, eyes wide as recognition fully settled in. "No, it cannot be," he whispered. But it was. The patterns, the control, the calm execution, it all pointed to one thing, one identity that did not match the image they had all accepted just minutes ago. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just still, as if the answer had already reached him before anyone else could confirm it. And Ethan finally looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time without hesitation, without emotion, just clarity. And in that quiet exchange, everything was understood, no announcement was needed, no title spoken aloud, because the board had already said it. Every move, every pause, every decision had revealed the truth piece by piece. And now, as the room stood in complete silence, the weight of that realization settled fully into place, undeniable, irreversible, and far more powerful than anything anyone had expected when this game first began. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a room waking up from something it could not fully explain. A few people stepped back, others leaned closer, but no one spoke loudly anymore, because something had shifted beyond words. Richard remained seated, his eyes no longer fixed on the board, but somewhere between the pieces and the man across from him, as if trying to understand how he had misjudged so completely. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. You knew from the start, it was not a question, it was recognition, and Ethan did not deny it. He simply stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor, the sound echoing in the stillness. Not as a declaration, but as a conclusion. He reached out and adjusted one last piece, aligning it perfectly. A small gesture, almost invisible, but it carried the weight of everything that had just happened, because it was not about winning. It was about precision, about respect for the game itself. Richard watched that movement closely, his expression no longer defensive, no longer searching, just still, absorbing the moment in a way he had not expected to. Around them, the room remained quiet, not out of confusion anymore, but out of understanding, the kind that comes when something undeniable has been revealed without needing explanation. A man near the back shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief, while another stood motionless, eyes fixed on Ethan as if trying to memorize the moment. Ethan did not look at them. He did not acknowledge the attention. He simply stepped away from the table, his posture unchanged, calm, steady, as if this was never about proving anything to anyone in the first place. Richard finally stood as well, slower, more deliberate, and for a brief moment, he looked as though he might say something more, something to reclaim control, but the words never came, because there was nothing left to claim. The board had already decided that, and as Ethan walked toward the exit, the sound of his footsteps soft against the floor, the room did not follow, it did not call out, it simply watched, because sometimes the loudest lesson is the one that leaves without a word. And that day, in a room built on strategy and intellect, something far more important had been revealed, not about the game, not about title,